Allô? Bonjour, bienvenue à toutes et à tous.
Hello, welcome everybody.
Aujourd'hui, c'est la première
Today
activité de la
is the
conférence de
first
l'Alliance
activity
canadienne
of
de
the conference of the Canadian
l'électrification
Alliance
scolaire.
for
Notre
Electrification
thème,
of School Buses.
le thème de la
Our
conférence,
theme, the
c'est
theme of this
celui d'aujourd'hui,
conference,
c'est électrifier
the meeting today,
parc d'autobus
is
scolaires
to
au Canada,
electrify
enjeux,
the
priorités
fleet
et
of school
solutions.
buses in Canada.
Mon
Issues,
nom est Louise
realities, and
Lévesque, je suis
solutions. My name is
directrice des
Louise
politiques
Levesque. I am
mobilité
Director of
Électrique Canada.
Policy at
Qu'est-ce que
Mobility
c'est
Canada.
cette organisation?
Canada Electric
C'est
Mobility.
une
What is this
association
organization? It
industrielle
is an
pan-canadienne.
industrial
On regroupe des
association,
membres de
pan-Canadian.
l'industrie
We
de
have
l'électrification des
people
transports.
around the country from
Dans
for
tout l'écosystème,
electrification
que
of
ce soit
transportation
des
and any
mines
ecosystem,
jusqu'aux
whether it be
utilisateurs finaux,
mines
en passant
up
par
until
l'infrastructure de
final
recharge,
users, the residential users,
les
charging
manufactures de
infrastructure,
véhicules
and
également.
manufacturing vehicles
On
as well.
représente
So we
l'industrie
represent
de
the
l'électrification des transports
industry
au Canada.
to electrify
Je suis
transport in
l'animatrice
Canada.
de ce
I
panel et
am
notre
your
sujet
host today for
aujourd'hui
this
est
panel, and
trouver
our
les
subject
pistes
today is
vers un parc
exploring
d'autobus scolaires
possible
100%
solutions
électrique.
for a 100% fleet of electric school buses.
Je vais prendre un moment pour faire
So I will
reconnaissance. Les
take
bureaux
a
d'Équiterre sont
moment to
situés sur le
recognize that the
territoire
offices of
autochtone
Équiterre
uncédé
are
par la
situated
loi
on
du Permis
unceded
que nous
First
appelons
Nations territory
Montréal,
that we
Montréal,
call
Québec.
today
Nous
Montreal and
reconnaissons
Quebec.
que les
We
premiers peuples
recognize
protègent leur
that the
territoire
first
depuis
people
des
protect their
millénaires
territory
et
and
utilisent
steward
leur
for
savoir
time
traditionnel pour
immemorial, and they
garder
use
les
their
terres
traditional
vives.
knowledge to
Nous
keep the
sommes
waters and
reconnaissants
the
de
land
vivre
safe.
sur
We
ce
are
territoire et
very
tenons à
fortunate to
poursuivre nos
live on this
efforts pour le
territory, and we
protéger.
want to continue our efforts to protect it.
Alors, aujourd'hui,
So
avec
today,
nos panélistes,
with
nous
our
dévoilons
panelists,
le nouveau rapport
we
de
are
recherche de
presenting the
Dunsky
new
Energy+,
report from
qui s'intitule
Dunsky
Possibles
Energy+Climate
solutions pour
called
l'électrification des
Possible
flottes
Solutions
d'autobus
for
scolaires au Canada.
Electrification of Electric
Ce rapport examine la
school
faisabilité
buses, for
d'atteindre
school
un
buses
parc d'autobus
being
scolaires
electric in
100%
Canada. So
électrique
this
d'ici
is to
2040
have
et
a 100%
évaluer un
electric
échéancier
school
plus
bus fleet
ambitieux
before
et
2040, and
envisageable.
if maybe
À la
we can
suite
do
d'une
it
courte
before that.
présentation
After a
de
short
l'Alliance canadienne pour
presentation of the
l'électrification
Canadian
des autobus
Alliance for
scolaires
Electrification
et
of
de nos
School Buses
panélistes,
and
il y
our
aura un panel de
panelists,
discussion
there will be a
autour
discussion
des
panel,
résultats de ce
a
rapport.
discussion group around the results of this
Si vous
report.
avez des questions
If
durant
you have any
les
questions
présentations,
during
gardez-les
the
pour la fin.
presentations,
Il y aura une
please keep them to
période
the
où
end.
on
There
pourra
will be
échanger
a Q&A
aussi
period where we can have some
personnellement.
discussions, and also with the people following us online.
Pour justement les personnes qui se joignent à nous en
For
ligne,
the
merci
people who
de
are with
partager vos
us
questions.
online,
Modérez
thank
les
you
questions.
for sharing
À
your
la fin,
questions in the Q&A
on
tab.
communiquera ces
At the
questions
end,
aux
we will
panélistes
read these questions to the
quand le moment sera venu.
panelists when there will be the appropriate time to do so. So, sorry, I'm managing a few things at the same time here.
Vous m'entendez bien là-bas?
Can you hear me?
Ça va bien aussi en ligne? C'est bon? Okay.
Yes, you can hear me online? Good. Okay.
Alors, l'Alliance
So,
canadienne pour
the
l'électrification
Canadian
des autobus
Alliance
scolaires
for the
est une
Electrification of
initiative
School
lancée
Buses
en
is an
avril
initiative
2022 par
launched in
Équiterre
April
et Green Communities,
2022 by Équiterre and
alliant
Green
les
Communities,
organisations militantes
bringing
en
together
faveur d'une
organizations
politique
who are
qui
fighting
accélère la
for
transition vers
policies
les
that
autobus
accelerate the
scolaires
transition
électriques à
towards
travers le
electric
pays.
school buses around
Notre
the
mission est de
country.
soutenir et
Our
collaborer
mission
avec
is to
toutes les parties
support and
prenantes du transport
collaborate with
scolaire
all
afin
stakeholders
d'obtenir
in
des
the
engagements
educational transportation to
fédéraux et
have
provinciaux qui
federal,
permettent
provincial, and
d'électrifier
territorial
100% des parcs
undertakings,
d'autobus
engagements to
scolaires
electrify 100% of the school buses
d'électrifier, excusez,
and
100% des parcs
electrify
canadiens d'autobus
100%
scolaires
of the
d'ici
school
2040.
buses before
Ou avant.
2040 or before 2040 or before, as we will see.
Alors aujourd'hui, comme mentionné plus tôt, nous marquons
So,
le
as
début de la
mentioned,
conférence
we
de
mark
l'Alliance.
the beginning of the conference of the Alliance,
C'est composé de 4
of the Alliance, and it's
Aujourd'hui, c'est le
4
premier.
events. Today is the first one.
La conférence rassemble
The
des chercheurs,
conference
des
brings
chercheuses, des
together
responsables
research
gouvernementaux et des gestionnaires de parcs
people,
d'autobus à
government
travers le pays pour
representatives,
échanger et
and
trouver
managers
de
of school bus
l'électrification
fleets around the
du parc
country to have
canadien
discussions and
d'autobus
exchange
scolaires.
around electrifying the Canadian school bus fleet.
Ça me prendrait une main de plus.
I need an extra hand.
Alors, c'est peut-être dans l'évolution de l'espèce, on va avoir ça.
Maybe in human evolution, at some point, we will have a third hand.
Là, je pourrais avoir une quatrième pour mon
Then I could have a fourth one for my cell phone too.
Alors, comme j'ai mentionné
Okay,
plus tôt,
so as mentioned earlier, we are having discussions today around the feasibility of reaching a 100% electric school bus fleet But we're talking about these buses. You know these blue buses that we're talking about today. If you didn't know, look at these buses that you will see on the road, the blue ones, and if the bumper if the bumper is blue, then you will know that it's an electric vehicle. So today we have with us Jeff Turner, Director of Sustainable Mobility at Dunsky Climate, and he has 13 years of experience with automobiles, research, and public service and governments. His work is concentrated around engineering of vehicles, personal and commercial, infrastructure for charging electric vehicles, and technology for networking of electric vehicles. Thank you, Louise. Welcome, Jeff. Very interesting for me to be here. It's a subject that I'm very interested in personally. I have a 6-year-old son. Just yesterday, he had a field trip with the school. First thing he said, the bus was a diesel bus, but I saw an electric bus with the blue bumper. So it was really great for me to hear that. I am the director. Do my introduction now? I'm the mobility director, sustainable mobility director at Dunsky Expertise and Energy Expertise. We're here at the Maison de Développement Durable. We have offices in Toronto and Vancouver as well, and we help governments and public services and other organizations to help them to accelerate the transition, the energy transition. When I say sustainable mobility, my work is to concentrate on how to electrify transportation. So thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you today. We're happy to have you as well. To better understand the federal support for the energy transition, Marc-André Vieux is here, Director of Government Relations with Équiterre. Before joining Équiterre, Marc-André has been a political strategist at the different levels of government. He was the press specialist at the House of Commons in Ottawa, before contributing to the victory of Valérie Plante at the municipal elections in 2017. At the cabinet of the mayor and the executive committee of the city of Montreal, he has been director of communication and main advisor for government relations for the city of Montreal. Hello, Marc-André. Hello. Thank you. Happy to be here. You've heard my bio. I'm clearly not the expert. It's Jeff, but I want to take this opportunity to highlight, to mention the work done by Valérie Plante, my colleague who is here, who has coordinated the work of the Alliance, to work that has been possible thanks to our funders, notably the Marianne Pottier Foundation. So it's thanks to them that we could accomplish this work. Équiterre, well, we are 30 years old this year. We turned 30 years of talking about the environment, talking about electrification of transportation. In general, we have evolved a lot in electrification of transportation, and now we're going to assisted electrical bicycles until buses, all the way up to buses and cars. So I think there's just skateboards that are not electric yet, but we still have a great electric vehicle operating programs, educational programs, research programs to favorize the implementation and encourage the government to realize this electrification of transportation. Like Jeff, I have two kids, one that will be 4 next week, and I have a 7.5-year-old girl. And yes, they always prefer the blue bumper on the bus. It stinks less, they say, and they like the the jingle when the bus starts. So for our children, mainly for reducing greenhouse gases for air quality, we are happy to be able to participate in this project. It's a project that is pleasant to our ears. Thank you. I will take a minute to say I have 2 as well, but they are adults and they don't have cars. And they always say, both of them, that they will try for as long as possible to not drive a car. We're talking about school buses today, and there's an awareness around young people and school buses. The public transit that my girl used should always be the first choice. First choice when it's available, when there are practical solutions, you take public transit. Then, if active transportation as well, active transit, which becomes another possibility in certain cases. And if you have to take your car, well, ideally you use something very gas efficient, fuel efficient, or electric. Yesterday, I had to come to Montreal by bus from Clavière to Montreal. It's not far, but I have access to the bus. I had to change the last minute because there was only one departure and I couldn't take that one. So I was talking about that earlier with a few of my colleagues from Équiterre. I was disappointed to not be able to come to Montreal by bus and leave my car behind. But I'm here with an electric car. That's my second option. I couldn't have come here by bike or on foot. So we will start our discussion on school buses. Marc-André, first question for you. The Canadian Alliance for Electrification of School Buses, supported by Équiterre in collaboration with Green Communities Canada, and militating and fighting for a 100% target of electric school buses for 2040 in Canada. School buses represent a small fraction of the greenhouse emissions in Canada. Why are we interested in this segment instead of talking about electrification of other heavy vehicle for transport? It's an excellent question. I will try to break it down into different parts. I will start by the why. The answer is that it's easy. In English, they say low-hanging fruit. They call it low-hanging fruit. And why? Well, two aspects. From the political standpoint, electrification of school buses is fruitful. Nobody is against virtually. Nobody hates apple pie. So to say to people you want to stop children from breathing diesel fumes, it's a pretty convincing argument generally. And from a technical standpoint, it's also easier to electrify. There are itineraries that are regular, predictable, and once the trip is done, the bus can charge their batteries. They drop the children off at school, and they have a whole bunch of time before picking them up, and those are perfect candidates for electrification. For heavy vehicles, these are vehicles that are generally difficult to decarbonize the heavy vehicles. But when we talk about reducing greenhouse gases, we aren't talking about huge reductions. So the government of Quebec, in their objective for 2024, with the electrification of 14% of their fleet of vehicles, wants to reduce 65,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions on 36 megatons. We are in fractions that are very small. But the sector of heavy transit is a sector where the emissions are strong growth. So any reduction in this sector are reductions that we are happy to take. But we have to also remember that we are electrifying collective transit as well, which is by its very nature, public transit is a mode of transportation that is low in carbon intensity, given that it transports a lot of passengers at once. So we will not maximize the reductions that are possible. But again, as I said earlier, it's still an interesting proposition. If we go more into detail into the numbers now, we are talking, if we paint the picture, 45 to 50,000 school buses in service in Canada. Most of them are diesel. In this fleet of vehicles, we have 45% of it that is less than 5 years old, 33% between 6 and 10 years old, and the rest older than 10 years. So you think that a bus has a life cycle of about 12 years. So we have 55% of the fleet of buses that will be replaced in the coming 6 years. 22% of the fleet will be replaced in the 2 or 3 years coming. So there's a significant pressure, and we have a chance to discuss that. There's still some significant pressure on replacing certain vehicles short term. just to underline the pressure, because if you replace it today by non-electric, by another diesel vehicle, we're stuck with that diesel vehicle for at least 10 years. If not, then it would be the premature retreat or taking off vehicle. Just a reduction of the source. We don't want to put a bus on the road, a diesel bus that we will have to replace 5 years later because the supply chain will allow us, etc., etc. So the question of extending the life cycle of certain buses can be counterintuitive, but there's no need. The government of Quebec has done it in certain cases to lengthen the life of certain buses to better manage the replacement of buses. If you look at the numbers now, the targets mainly in Quebec. So Quebec wants 65% of electrification of their school bus fleet before 2030 and 37.5% reduction of greenhouse gases in general. It's not a very high target. We can make gains elsewhere as well, eventually. It's another subject. But short term, I talked about that earlier, that before the 31st of March 2024, we were on 14% of electrification of the fleet. The government of Canada doesn't have specific objectives for electrification of school buses, given that it's a provincial responsibility. So what they have are general objectives for heavy and medium vehicles. 35% of sales, 100% of sales for 24. We're talking about sales of these vehicles and not conversion. So our report and the report that we're presenting today that seeks to evaluate the feasibility of a fleet that is 100% electric before 2040, and I will reveal that it's feasible. But we'll see that in more detail. So I will hand it over to Louise for the next question. But before, I just want to say that what we've seen is we can decarbonize. We can electrify school buses. There's a consensus, there's a will, there's a political leadership to do so. And what's interesting is what we'd like to see is that this leadership will be a springboard for the electrification of other sectors. Jeff?
OK, ça va. Moi, j'aurais juste un compliment.
Just want to add to what you said. I don't know if you talked about that in the report or not, but when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we should never forget also that vehicles emit other things than just greenhouse gases. These are pollution, toxic emissions. We are affected by that every day. In the streets here, we walk, do active transit, but all these vehicles around us spew atmospheric pollution that has a direct effect on health. There's recognized, there are reports and studies that show the days of hospitalization and premature death because of pollution. We're talking about school buses. These are our children that are exposed to these gases, this pollution. So for me, that's one more reason to electrify these vehicles. I'm just going to add something and initial question. Why do we want to electrify school buses? It's a way to educate. It's for all heavy and medium vehicles, the one we interact with very often. And it's a way to educate people, children especially, of the benefits of electric transportation and develop enthusiasm for electrification of transit in general. Yes, that's a good reason, no doubt. So this will be for both our panelists. Maybe I'll let you begin for this question. In Quebec, particularly in Montreal, we see more and more yellow school buses with the blue bumper. And that's in great part because the measures put in place by the government of Quebec to sustain the transition towards electric school buses. What about Canada? What is the state of the school buses in Canada? What are the measures undertaken by governments to support the adoption of electric school buses? Jeff? Yes. So I think Marc-André had already mentioned we are talking about 45,000 to 50,000 school buses in circulation. I'm impressed by that. There's a lot of them. Yes, about 10,000 in Quebec, and so it's proportionate to the population. But in terms of electric school buses, we include a few estimates in our report. It's about 500 electric school buses today around the country. Maybe a half of that is in Quebec, and the rest, a big number in BC and PEI, where we have seen a lot of support for these buses. So it's encouraging, but we're really at the beginning of the process. So in talking about these governments, I'm going to talk about the provincial programs, and Marc-André will talk about the federal government. In BC and here in Quebec, we have subsidies, pretty generous ones, about 100,000 to 200,000 per vehicle. So it helps a lot with the initial cost of these vehicles. And in PEI, we see a tight collaboration between the provincial government and the federal government to use the federal support that was announced. Maybe I'll give that over to Marc-André to talk about the federal government. Maybe just before talking about the federal government, I will say a few words about Quebec. So the subsidy to buy electric school buses is 150,000 for 2021-2022 and 125,000 for 2022-2023. And another element as well that is interesting in this whole process is the will that we see in the green economy plan for the government of Quebec to put in place in the coming years a standard for zero emission vehicles, for medium and heavy vehicles. So what we've seen and what we've done in Quebec, we were first in Quebec for electrification of personal vehicles. We want to, the intention is there, the third iteration of the green economy plan. So we want to replicate that to be able to accelerate and put in place the winning conditions to ensure success. There's the success also goes through regulatory framework. I'm just going to explain what is a standard, we call it here in Quebec, the zero emissions bill. There's a bill here that obligates automobile manufacturers to sell, to ensure a certain percentage of sales of their vehicles, light vehicles, whether they have to be electric. So the governments, Canada, and also the provinces, Quebec among them, which is often the leader in this aspect, put in place a standard, a zero emissions law for medium and heavy vehicles that includes school buses. Yes, and it's true that when we're in this industry, we talk about standard zero emission vehicles. We assume that we understand that we could explain. So for the federal programs, two programs that the federal government offers to help the provinces to electrify the vehicles that school buses. So the funds for public transit, zero emission public transit, is the infrastructure fund from Canada that invests $2.75 million over 5 years. It started in 2021 to support buying school buses and public transit buses that are electric and build the infrastructure to support that, including charging infrastructure. So that's the first fund. And there's another fund, the infrastructure fund for zero emissions vehicles that is administered by Natural Resources Canada that wants to remedy the lack of charging stations in Canada, which is a major obstacle, of course, to the adoption of zero emission vehicles. For school buses, I think the charging stations will be in the parking lots These are not buses that will come into the public charging station. It would be difficult in terms of the dimension of vehicles, but also especially if they're vehicles that generally return to a bus depot every night. It's pretty easy to charge them there. I live in the country, and I see there are school buses that spend the night at the house of the bus driver. That's a challenge we're exploring a little bit at PEI. And yes, you see that. So it's not impossible. You can install charging stations at the bus driver's house. You don't really need powerful charging stations because of the needs of energy needs for buses. Typically, sometimes electric vehicles, whether it be light or heavy or medium, we will charge them. And so we're in the context of the school buses. It's perfect for that because you use them twice a day, and the rest of the time they are parked and they can be charged. There's also a few other programs, for example, I don't want to get into all the details, the federal programs and everything, but we have the initiative for zero emissions buses administered by the Bank of Canada, and also deductions to amortize the costs offered for acquisition of these buses. Excellent. I just also want to talk about the provinces. They target the announced at PEI. They want to get to 100% of school buses in 2030. So it's pretty ambitious, and it's worth looking at the distinction in the target in the number of vehicles in first circulation versus the number of sales of new vehicles. We're talking about a law for medium and heavy vehicles in California, for example, reaching 100% of sales before 2040. So it's less ambitious because, like Matthew said, there's a lot of segments of transit, heavy and medium, especially trucks. Long distance trucking is a bit more difficult to electrify. It could be feasible eventually, but for now, school buses are really much easier to electrify, and that is why I think we could have a much more ambitious target as we see on PEI. I think that's something that we're going to look at. We like ambitious targets. When somebody has a more ambitious target than us, it's PEI, they're more ambitious than we are. We're going to say to come back and look, they're doing better than us. So, the same thing for the zero emissions law. BC had raised their targets, and they say in Quebec, you're not doing it anymore. So we will continue with another question. I will begin with Jeff. We often hear in the news about issues of production capacity of batteries and electric vehicles, and more recently, we're talking about issues of supply chain, electric supply. To grow with electricity, and how many buses need to be converted? Well, we talked about that earlier, but we can get into the numbers. How many buses will be converted in Canada to reach our target in 2030? And from a logistical standpoint, is electrification of the fleet of school buses for 2030, is it realistic? These are good questions. And of course, the constraint on supply chain is a subject we've been studying for many years at Dunsky. We've been working since 2018 with the government of Canada on the subject of loading lines for light vehicles in car dealerships. We know that it was a challenge in the last years, and we see that right now it's a challenge also for medium and heavy vehicles. But it's a short-term challenge versus the feasibility of these targets long-term. Generally, we're talking about, as we mentioned, 45 to 50,000 school buses. To electrify them, it will take, before 2040, for example, it will take about 3,000 to 5,000 vehicles on average each year to electrify. Per year, yes, exactly. But that said, in our report, we looked at the needs, the capacity of energy for the batteries of these type of vehicles, and it will be the reduction of greenhouse gases. It's not a huge fraction of greenhouse gases, but at the same time, it's not fairly insignificant in terms of the needs of the batteries. And so, for example, we calculated that if we estimate the size of a battery for an electric school bus, we would need about 1 gigawatt hour per year for all the batteries in school buses that we need each year. So to give you some context, we're talking today about investment in battery production plants, and these are plants that can build about 40 gigawatt hours per year per plant. So, and in total, we looked at this in North America, and we're talking about a capacity in North America of about 500 gigawatt hours per year from 2030. So the 1 gigawatt hour that we need for the buses doesn't represent a big proportion of the whole. So from that standpoint, I would say that it's completely feasible. That said, I think it's a question of being in an accelerated development period right now. We are really at the beginning. For the next years, we will need to accelerate rapidly all the aspects of the supply chain. So it's going to take a few years before we can meet the need. Well, I think long term it's possible. I was at Bécancour yesterday for the announcement of the government for the energy transition, and there was some demonstrations of precursor batteries, and they also have a manufacturer of electric school buses in Quebec who will take, if you know, that will make their own batteries. So this transition is well underway. So we really have the impression that the current situation is not feasible, but what you're saying, Jeff, is we're on the right path and we will get there. There are certainly challenges, there's a lot of work to do, but I think we are ready to attack these challenges. And I think, yes, school buses are low-hanging fruit that we can start with to really give momentum to this transition. I completely agree with what Jeff said. There's no issue with technical capacity. If we're really talking about issues of volume to replace and the supply chain, and also not sure that we return, but the programs are there. Whereas there still may be some adjustments to be made to make sure that it is more easily accessible. There are simplified processes to have access to these funds, but otherwise, from a technical point of view, it's very possible, very realistic to be able to think that we can do that. But the fact that we have a significant number of buses that are coming to the end of their life very quickly is a bit of a puzzle, a challenge that we have to solve. I mentioned as well that we have not only one bus manufacturing group, we have three. We're very lucky compared to other parts of Canada that you know Girardet buses that is in Drummondville. But also in Drummondville, there's Thomas buses, Thomas buses, two manufacturers that are also going to build 100% electric school buses. So, we agree that it's possible then to electrify the fleet of school buses before 2040. Can we do that quicker? Can we even be more ambitious? And for this question, we're thinking about environmental and health issues, but also operational questions related to the replacement of these vehicles. Can we electrify 100% of the fleet for 2035? It's a good question. As I mentioned, I support any jurisdiction that wants to push in this direction because it's very important. So, of course, it's going to take some effort, but I think that if you look at PDI, for example, I support them 100%. So that said, for a national target in Canada that is more accelerated, like, for example, 100% of the fleet for 2035, I come back to this question of accelerated development. with a life cycle of 12 years of the buses, we would need 100% of the sales today to be electric. And in my opinion, that's something that we could do in certain regions, but I think it will take a few years for this accelerated development to produce battery electric vehicles, but also from infrastructure standpoint for recharging stations and education and the operators of the fleets. And that's why I would say that yes, it would be feasible, but 100% in 2030 is still very ambitious, but maybe a bit more flexible to accommodate this period of accelerated development. I will try to not repeat what Jeff said. I will use other language possibly, but it's at Équiterre, we're not the ones who will say that we can't and that we shouldn't do things quicker if we can. We are always the ones who push to accelerate things. We like ambitious targets and we like the speed. Like for example, PEI that wants to get there before 2030. That has created an attraction for others and an example to follow for the federal government that says, I want to standardize all of this, that there's less regional disparity. And then there are certain issues with jurisdiction, but that's another thing. So, any acceleration of taking away consumption of fossil fuels, reducing the fossil fuels, it's among the list positive. But the rate of conversion that we have to do is enormous. So Jeff talked about that. We're talking about in the first years, we have more than 5,000 vehicles to replace if you want to go to 100%. So that's why we have to unfortunately prolong the life of certain diesel buses to allow us to have long-term some significant advantages. But and so there will be some economies of scale for conversion. So there are benefits, but it has to be done the right way. And I will talk about the importance of regulation and not simply remain in objectives and targets that are good, but are not mandatory and that we could have regional disparities because of that. Of course, there will possibly be regional disparities because in Quebec we're more advanced. So there will be regional disparities, it's inevitable, but we have to attenuate these to get to harmonize the electrification. So what I feel is 2035 would be a bit ambitious, but I prefer ambitious targets, even if we do it in 2036 or 2038. But you're right, Nathalie. It's one part of it to have some targets. We have to put in place the policies and programs to allow to reach these targets. So recently, Electric Mobility Canada, we talked about recently that Quebec has proven to have been able to take action when we talk about transition to electric vehicles in public transit. There are some targets, but there are also measures put in place to be able to reach that. So bravo Quebec, and we will try to continue like that and give the necessary information to our politicians so that they can and bureaucrats so they can have better targets. We can encourage competition between provinces. I was 6 years in Vancouver, and I'll always talk about that with Quebec. So I think that this competition between provinces is good for everybody. Yes, here at Canada, we like to create competition between the provinces as well. So one last question for Marc-André, but Jeff, you can answer it as well. What is the necessary support from the federal government to accelerate the electrification of school buses across the nation? What are the means that we have to put in place to reach these objectives? Well, I don't want to be tiresome, but a standard on zero emissions vehicles for heavy transit. So a regulatory framework that will make sure that we will get there, that it won't simply be a pie in the sky objectives and targets. And we have to make sure we have long-term funding as well. We have programs right now. We talked about that. We have programs in the budgetary in the plan for the budget will not be there forever, but we also don't think that the same way as for personal vehicles, that the difference between the cost of diesel and electric vehicles is attenuating significantly. So we will need to have a support that is continuous, independently of the government that will put in place in Ottawa or Quebec. So the needs in capital are significant, and also an important aspect are the campaigns to raise awareness and educate on how we do it. And if there's no example, it's difficult. So we have to accompany, and we have to accompany locally in each of the provinces, and so that's what we do with the Alliance. We Alliance for Electric Transit, we give the tools necessary uh, so that each of the provinces, the operators that are affiliated with school boards, etc., uh, can have the tools to do it, understand how it works, know that there are resources to be able to get there. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Alliance has issued recommendations to the different provinces and territories. It's the objective of the Alliance, the Alliance for Public Transportation, Priority Transportation, to the in each of the provinces and to be able to talk about the reality of each province. And that was important for us. That's the way we want to move forward because, once again, the education and transportation, school transportation, education for young people. So it falls under the purview of provinces, and so it's up to the provinces to manage that. The federal government can come in and support and give a framework, but we need to have that at the provincial level. So that's how we thought about it with the Alliance, is to go and get some strength in each province to be able to use these resources and people so that we can get that. But we have to have an example, a process to follow, a common process to share victories and best practices, and also to be able to help each other and support each other and move forward together. Excellent. I would add on the educational aspect and the question of support. I think that there's an infrastructure part to it. We work a lot with governments, with the public service. We do a lot of evaluations and reports. So we receive questions from operators of fleets of vehicles that need help on the question of charging infrastructure. So it's not that complex, but when we start to have a great number of vehicles in the same building, etc., there's a certain need for education for best practices for charging vehicles, for engineers, for installers and operators, just to see what we need to do this transition. Having still looked up and said, yes, it's funny, when you have one, you use it, it's fine. But when you have 10 electric vehicles and you want to plug them at the same time, then you can have a power issue. So you have to learn, you have to share the power, you have to program the charging of the vehicle. To avoid that, there's all kinds of ways to do that. You don't want to plug in the electric vehicles in a consumption peak. So at peak consumption. So the federal government is playing a role in support programs for the installation and the operation of charging infrastructure. Yes, another aspect as well for which the federal government can intervene, and because they have this macro view on the question of supply as well, where they could be a coordinator of the supply if are some strategies or uniformity or the reduction of regional disparities to make sure that there's a supply of electric school buses to cover the territory of Canada. Well, thank you. So I found it very interesting and very enriching. Thank you for this discussion. We will now go to Q&A period. So we will begin with the questions of people in the room here, and then we will get some questions that come from people online. So once again, thank you for being with us today. So of course, the questions can be asked in the language of your choice. Are there any questions? Yes? Hello? I wanted to know if do you see any infrastructure issues with charging because some transportation companies may not have a huge fleet and it could be difficult to have that infrastructure. Are these collaborations possible? Are you seeing it with light vehicles, with municipal governments, public infrastructure and transportation companies that use their buses outside of school to do some charter service? Are there anything? Is there anything in Canada to help with that? I don't know if you talked about in the event. You have a connect there. That's something we look at here for public system to have some charging infrastructure. This is a question we see a lot. We work a lot with the municipalities, and they have their own fleet, and they ask us all the time, can we share our infrastructure with the public? I would say it's a bit complex because there are many aspects with the sharing of the infrastructure, especially the dimension of vehicles, that it can be very different. There can be a huge variation. Also, the profile. When do we need to charge the vehicles? And for school buses, it's a usage where a few hours of using the vehicle in the morning and the afternoon. Other than that, they need to be charged. And it's like a long window of charging that we can do that with a not so powerful charging station. So with that, there's not opportunity for other users to use those charging stations, but also where they're situated. It's very convenient to have them situated in the bus depots, and it's not necessarily convenient. That's one of my at Huntingford, one of the grocery stores. There's a depot beside the grocery store, but it'd be very complex to have cars coming in and out of the bus depot. So that said, I always estimated that the fleets, 100% that people have said the charging at home, but fleets, sometimes the buses are people's homes, fleet drivers' homes, but sometimes they need a quick charge because so it is possible that they may need high capacity charging stations that we could find in across different regions, but this is a question of if these fast charging stations were built with large vehicles in mind. So up to now, Quebec have one place in Laval where you have charging stations for large vehicles, but most of the other charging stations are really built for small vehicles. So this is something we can look at, but in our opinion, it would be more ideal to have charging stations that are made specifically for those vehicles in mind. So we see more and more the recommendations because in the beginning we had some targets for fast charging, and now we have more and more 3 or 4 fast charging stations. More and more for these mega sites, I receive comments from the industry that say that there should be at least one to be able to charge a bus. Let's say different context, and if we use them at night, especially it's in their parking lot where but maybe your question is interesting for other applications. So I see projects in Quebec where we have charging stations in schools, and during the day the personnel of the school uses them, and at night could be people who live in proximity but don't have a charging station. So they become like charging zones at night. There's nobody in the school parking lot at night anyway. So there's a complementarity there. But for school buses, the complementarity is much less obvious, much more difficult to manage. Thank you. Are there other questions? We can go to the questions online. One element we talked about a little bit in the recommendations, this question touches on that. We have a question here. Jeff, can you give more detail on the cost of electric buses versus diesel buses and the capital expenses needed to support the transition? Yes, certainly. So, as mentioned in the report, we have cost estimates of the vehicles. There are many types of school buses. You have C type, which are the most common, but we have A type that are smaller with a small truck chassis. But let's take the C type, which are the most common. Diesel buses typically is about $150,000. For electric, of the C type, we see prices of $350,000 to $400,000. So it's a 2 or 3 times the price. So that's why it's very important to look at the total cost of ownership, where we see $10,000 of savings in fuel versus electric per year. But still, with these prices, we made calculations in our report to see how much time it would take to recoup this initial expenditure without any subsidies. It would take 20 years. So it depends on the life cycle of vehicles. And with the support of the federal government, this reduces this return on investment to about 4 to 7 years. So it's much more interesting with this support. And we also mentioned in the report a few other sources of revenue, like regulation of fuel, clean fuels, regulation that where the operators of the fleets can get credits that would give them a few $1,000s additionally, and also bi-directional charging, something that's more experimental, but they could see programs and electrical utilities that give incentives to encourage this type of usage. So I would say that currently we certainly need the support, and eventually we will have a reduction of these excess costs, but it's a bit behind what we see with light vehicles. In our opinion, it will take at least a decade before we see the costs being reduced so that the total cost of ownership will be comparable to a diesel school bus. That's what we see in the light vehicles as well. We needed some help. We're not at parity yet, but we're close. It's coming. So it's the question of production. We already have plants that produce hundreds of thousands of vehicles per year. So we have a large reduction of prices that way with the light vehicles. Technical question, the life cycle, the 10-year life, I could understand in classical combustion vehicles, but electric vehicle will not have a longer life cycle, or it's difficult to say. I would say that generally, if you exclude the battery in terms of components of the power drive, it's much simpler. There's much less maintenance and much less moving parts, and we've also captured the cost of maintenance in our report. It's cheaper to maintain, but the cost of the battery. The battery, typically, we see that the batteries of an electric vehicle last for the life of the vehicle, but I would say maybe even more so with school buses, just because the usage with school buses is not very intensive. We're talking about 100, 120 kilometers a day, something like that. and compared to an urban bus where 300, 400 kilometers a day. So that's why we say that it's a segment that is very easy to electrify. And I think we will see that in the life cycle of the vehicle. So maybe, of course, sometimes we will stretch a personal vehicle longer and it becomes a bit beat up. But school buses, we don't want to see that before they are changed. So I imagine that the batteries can be recuperated for something else after if they last longer than the vehicle. But to recoup the excess cost of acquisition, the upfront cost, I think it would be possible to lengthen the life cycle of the bus. We can do that. We have many questions, yes. So I will not have to ask my own questions. A question that is anonymous that refers to sustainable development and sustainable mobility and the infrastructure the school buses will need. Is there a risk that the electrification of school buses affects the location of schools and the first priority should be active transportation, and that would affect that. So 28% of children and adolescents in Canada do the recommended level of physical activity every day. It's a crisis for public health that is coming. I can take that one. It seems more in my wheelhouse. It's the electrification of transit doesn't replace healthy living habits. So at Équiterre, we promote active transportation, uh, electric bikes, for example, but walking, everything, and we would have infrastructure for active transit, notably so that the young people can go from their house to school in a safe way. So we're getting into another category. We're not even in electric, we're just in infrastructure, physical infrastructure in urban environments and sharing the public space and a lot of anger possibly from a lot of people because they have to share and there's not room and we have to go into this, we have to go take this direction. So electrification, as I always say, when consuming electricity is better than fossil fuels for sure, but it doesn't replace other better options for transit. It's just a complement and it's better for the environment. It's better for health of children. But of course, if children can go to school by bike or on foot, that's even better for them. I would say that that's why it's good to talk about targets as a percentage of vehicles and not an absolute number of vehicles. This way, we could have efforts to reduce the needs globally of school buses and with other ways to get to school. Walking to school would be ideal, I think. But if we have targets, it's really to make sure when we have school buses that they be electric and maximize the number of these buses that are electric. Great. So I have a question and a comment at the same time. So we have Philippe Langlois, who is Director of Operations at Chambly, who wanted to specify the question of the life cycle of buses that is determined by the Minister of Transport and not the manufacturers. So in Quebec, presently it's 12 years with a temporary extension to 14 years possible. So just to say that the bus can be used for passenger transportation after that. So for Philip's question, he would like to know why Quebec doesn't have access to the federal subsidies for acquisition of electric school buses and the program to help with major investments related to electric infrastructure. So why the transporters in Quebec, contrary to other provinces, cannot have access to the subsidy offered by the federal government in these two programs? I was wondering the same thing, and I don't have the answer. I think this is something we need to look at and try to find the answer. But generally, we see we have some subsidies for light vehicles. Of course, the incentives federal government are added to the incentives in the provinces. I don't know why it's not the case with school buses in Quebec. We should try and find the answers to that. And of course, uh, um, being in the federal government's place, we don't necessarily want to give money where we don't need to. If we're already at a point where the total cost of ownership for school buses is already interesting, but again, it's a question of equity in distributing these funds from the federal government. I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. Sorry. If I can try and answer that, the Ministère des Transports du Québec is in discussion with the federal government currently to see if there would be a way to simplify instead of having many programs for subsidies. And so in Quebec, one Quebec to in federal, so maybe the funds could be transferred directly to the province. So maybe it's an issue that will be resolved in the coming years, but presently in Quebec, we don't have access to that. Sometimes there's a question of complementary programs and a will to not copy things or double up on things that have already been done, and also collaborate with certain transportation uh, companies in certain sectors. I don't have the answer, but I think we have certain partial answers. But I think simplification of and standardization will come. We are still in the beginning of the process, and so we hope that it can be clarified. And we see for light vehicles, we can have a federal help with a provincial program to buy a light vehicle. So this assistance should be able to be accumulated for school buses as well. I have a question from Conrad Kaiser. It's in English. I will read it in French because we have our translation. So the question is, do we have an idea how the charging infrastructure can be installed at the houses of school bus drivers and how the feasibility of that can be determined? It's a interesting question. Um, to give you some context, we often talk about there's an evolution we currently see with the charging stations for electric school buses. Additionally, for a lot of buses that were use level two charging stations, so 240 volt, sorry, just like an oven with greater power with 80 amps, for example. So we see light vehicles that use charging stations like that. There's the Teslas, Ford F-150s, and it could be enough for a school bus, depending on the distances and the usage of the bus. So we see with manufacturers a trend towards AC charging stations, quick charging, and DC, sorry, direct current. And so see the houses are level two, 240 volts. And so the power required can be a bit more than we have the capacity in a typical residence. But that said, it's not, I think there's a pilot right now at PEI, bus drivers exploring the idea of pilot program to add a new service as if there was another house built next to your house. It's not complex to add another electrical connection dedicated for a charging station for a school bus, but it would probably require a review of policy because it's not anybody who can just ask for this kind of thing. Hydro-Quebec, for example, would have to have to manage it. It's an issue, but I see it at my house. I passed in front of a house with a school bus parked there this morning, but I think it's not impossible to do. We can possibly do it. So the issue of location, um, it's a physical issue. If there's space near the house or in front of the house that will allow the bus to park there. When you park a bus at home, I think you need a lot of room to do that. And there is also, as you mentioned, the connection, electrical connection panel. If there's not enough, a supplementary connection will allow us then to manage the electrical consumption in the sense that it's a dedicated connection. The operator of the bus can connect it, and it's not his personal collection at home. It's a separate. Yes, it would be possible to add a 80 amp circuit into a residence, but we would need a meter to measure consumption separate. It would be a separate account. So next question, and once again, related to the subsidy programs. So an anonymous question, what are the programs for support of the federal government to buy and operate new electric buses? Are they paired with provincial programs? I think we're talking here about Quebec. We talked about that, but maybe for the provincial program in BC, knowing that the objective is not to double up on the number of programs, but so that we have the most access to subsidies possible. I think that we're certainly talking about the fund for public transit, for zero emission public transit. They have announced $2.75 million in the 5-year window, and with that we can cover about 80% of the planning stage and 50% of the capital investment stage for school buses or public transit. Once again, I think that it's the same situation in BC, where we already see that there are programs for Subsidy Clean BC that offer between $100,000 to $200,000 per bus. And I think that it's a similar issue in terms of synchronization with this federal program. I don't know the details, but I imagine that it would be the same thing that we talked about earlier here in Quebec, finding a way to synchronize these programs and simplify. When in PEI, I know that we already have a collaboration between the provincial government and the federal government to support the operators of the school buses. Yes, I think this is something done by province to get to these agreements, negotiations province by province. Question of Mike Franklin, who's asking maybe a question more for Jeff. Is there less maintenance on electric school buses versus diesel? I think also in terms of cost, there's a big difference. Yes, this is something we're trying to quantify in the report. Generally, there are very few maintenance operations to do with electric vehicles. The electric motors are very simple. There's not much maintenance to do. There's no oil changes required. And in terms of brakes, we don't need friction brakes, disc brakes as often, because electric motors can work like a generator to slow down by compression without using the brakes. So the maintenance of brakes is reduced significantly, and there's really not much except there's still a need to do inspections, of course, and maintenance of suspension and things like that. But most of the maintenance that you see on a regular vehicle, there's a big difference. Most of the maintenance doesn't need to be done on electric vehicles. So it's really interesting for operators. It could be an issue in terms of the role of the operators and the type of jobs needed in those industries. So it's really one of the benefits of this technology. Don't forget that there's no anti-pollution system needed and no exhaust. Next question, anonymous. If you want an acceleration of the transition towards electric buses, have you made the recommendation to open the market up to all suppliers of school buses? I imagine here we're talking more about the Quebec program that demands that the buses admissible to the subsidy be 100% made in Canada. There's the report talk about this question. No, I don't think we talk about that issue. Economic issues as well that have to be considered in terms of employment, in terms of economic benefits as well. So the governments make choices that must be beneficial for society. So maybe Luis, you have something to add? Yes, Mobility Canada, we are doing presentations to for Quebec, notably. We mentioned the 3 manufacturers in Quebec, and there's one manufacturer Thomas, right now, the buses are not admissible to the subsidy because the government considers that there's not a sufficient portion of the assembly that is done here. But there is assembly done in Quebec, a lot of it, and the final assembly is done here. There are maintenance teams everywhere in Quebec because it involves a lot of jobs everywhere in Quebec. So this organization also supplies about 30% of the school buses. The three of them share the market. So if there's no opening there, um, it could imperil the organization. For Girardin, they had the same problem a few years ago. And I remember the presentations we made for that. I think they were able to have an agreement for a limited number of buses admissible to the program. And when they will have reached that number, the next buses will not be eligible. So if you understand, an operator wants to buy or has to buy electric buses, he has the option A at 300,000 with 100,000, 50,000 subsidy, and B with 300,000 with zero subsidy. It's a pretty easy decision. But in the electrification, there's international trade, there's economic development issues. These are considerations that we have to maintain. It's a market, it's an industry to supply these buses. Thank you. And last question online before other people ask questions here from the floor. Chris Field was asking for the school bus fleets that are operated privately, which is the majority of the case in Quebec, the deduction for accelerated amortization that we talked about at the beginning, is it also available for private transportation companies? I believe so, but I never heard a reason why it wouldn't be available for them. But I don't know really. Good question. If I'm not mistaken, I think that it was as long as the person who's making the request is a business that is profitable, the person could have access to the deduction. So I imagine that in the case of public transportation, private transporters, they could have access. Yes, in the report, we say that government organizations and nonprofits don't have access to this program. So, which really leaves the space for private enterprise. And perfect. And we have, no, we have a question that got added, but for Quebec, it's about 100,000 of subsidies right now until the 31st of March, 2024. Excellent. And another question from Snap Kenny. What do you think of the charging solutions for large fleets? I can take that. I think Louise had already mentioned the importance of managing energy. Of course, with a school bus, it's not a problem, but as soon as you have 10 or 20 vehicles at the same place, it becomes very significant to manage power consumption to avoid excess load during peak hours. So we have many options to manage that. We have intelligent charging stations that can modulate the power depending on the capacity and depending on a predetermined schedule so that we can really maximize the usage of electric capacity in maintaining the demand under a certain limit to minimize these costs. So this is the starting point. It's not a very complex or expensive technology. It's pretty easy. I've already worked with when I was at BC Hydro. We done demos of many technologies that can do that. And what is even more interesting in the coming future, near future, will be the option of using the buses as a source of energy with bidirectional charging. This is the subject, Louise and I, we had the opportunity to look at that with Mobility Electric Canada in the last months. I would say that if bidirectional charging can work somewhere, it would be with school buses. These are vehicles with a big battery, relatively big, that spend a lot of time parked. And this is something that we looked at in the report to see what are the opportunities and the possibilities to have sources of revenue in using these batteries. It depends on the service. If the usage of the service that these vehicles can meet and need that they can meet, that the incentives are worthwhile. But there's also the aspect of a source of energy during power outages. We just saw recently with the PEI government, they've announced that they will use these school buses as a source of energy, zero emissions in security centers and emergency response. So for me, it's very interesting as a way to use these resources in a very smart way. That's great. I'm just going to vulgarize a little bit. We talk about smart charging and sharing of power. I'll give you an example. It's a fictitious example, but you have three buses parked and they are charging, and they each have a charging station, 30 amps, but they share a 30 amp circuit. So in the beginning, each of the buses will draw about 10 amps. It's slow, and then one of the buses will be full, and that will liberate the 10 amps, will be shared with the two other ones, and they will each have 15. And then at the end, the last bus will have the full 30 amps. But we have to calculate that. You have to make sure that everybody is ready for their next run on time. The other possibility is to program the charges to say you will charge from 8 to midnight, you will charge from midnight to, that's more complex a little bit, but there are ways to manage power consumption. We will plan, we will tell the system we don't want you to surpass X um, power, and we're going to use the tools, the most efficient tools, to stay underneath that threshold to not use excessive power. That concludes the questions on. Well, thank you. It was really very interesting. So thank you for having shared your expertise with us today. Thank you to the people present here with us. Thank you to all the people online as well for your presence and for your excellent questions. I forgot my third hand. Okay, so to learn more about the Canadian Alliance for Electrifying School Buses and to get a full version of the report, we would invite you to visit the website eschoolbusalliance.ca. Is the address on the screen? Yes? Okay. And so if this activity was enjoyable for you, I remind you that there are three other activities in the conference in the coming days, and the panel on the support for electrification of transportation at the provincial level. We talked about that a little bit today. So I imagine that this panel will go much further and deeper in some of the questions we asked today. So we will have in this activity government people from Quebec, from PEI, and from BC. I think these are the three leaders in Canada. We wish you a wonderful day, and thank you once again for having been with us for this activity. Thank you.